Welcome to my talk, VR Lessons Learned in a Level Design of Blood and Truth. So as the title of the talk suggests, we're going to be focusing entirely around VR. And starting off, I'm going to touch up on the topics of traversal and metrics, both of which are extremely important elements to VR, as together they create a foundation of comfortable spatial awareness and movement. Next up, gameplay mechanics, which I like to refer to as a level designer's palette, as these are all the things that level designers should be taking creative risks with in an attempt to make the best possible level. And finally, we'll break down a level beat by beat, discussing all the core VR considerations along the way. Before we jump into all of that, my name is Shirazi. I'm the lead level designer at Sony's London studio, and these are some of the games that I've worked on over the past 10 years as a level designer. For the past 5 years, however, I've been working exclusively within VR. And I think that as a team at London Studio, we probably make the most expensive VR titles on the market. So I wanted to share some lessons I've personally learned working in AAA VR, which I hope will shed light on what I consider to be some must-have considerations whenever making a VR game. And for those of you who haven't played or seen any of Blood and Truth, here's the launch trailer for the game.
What do I want? Your operation.
He's not going to start an all-out war. He's not big enough.
I'm gonna go and find out.
You're just gonna walk in there.
Sack goes in the streets of London. Sack goes in the London city. Sack goes in the streets of London. Sack got to be something brilliant. Today a legend is born, ready for vengeance rather than war. Ready for anything, ready for more. My English gangster, I'm definitely sure. I'm coming for you. 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 I'm coming for you.
We need to push back hard or we're finished.
For the players.
So from the trailer, we can gather that Blood and Truth is an action-adventure FPS. It features some drama in the form of a revenge story, gunplay, fuse breaker puzzles, and high-action set pieces. Okay, so as mentioned in the agenda, we're going to quickly review what traversal means to Blood and Truth. To embody one of the core pillars of the game, being the action hero means that the controls need to be as intuitive as possible. And here's a clip of how it works in-game. The player is presented with a choice of waypoints. When they choose one, they press the move button to go. They can strafe and cover, but the player is always essentially making forward progress from one piece of cover to another. Think of it a bit like an automated roadie run in Gears, with the ability to shoot the whole way. And we actually consulted with a former SAS soldier on how they move in combat situations. And this concept of staying low and pushing forward towards danger actually fits in line with how the SAS operate. So some comfort considerations to take note of. We do a small amount of easing in and easing out when we start and stop moving. And we also vary the speed depending on the distance that the player has moved. So the shorter the distance, the slower the movement. And this is because we found that moving short distances quickly was a comfort trigger. We also deliberately split up chunks of the level to work with either standing or crouch traversal, as moving up and down repeatedly can also be a comfort trigger too. Finally, we limited backtracking purely to where all of our weapons are located. And given the option to backtrack across the entire traversal graph, really increased the cognitive load on the player, which could easily lead to confusion with inside of firefights. And given our tagline for the game was "Be the action hero," we wanted to make sure our traversal method actually helped the player to fulfill this fantasy. And here's what it all looks like under the hood. Internally, we refer to this kind of gizmo information as proxies, so I'll be referring to proxy information throughout the rest of the talk. And as you can see, it's a spline network. Lots of forward and diagonal movements. And the other time we ever rotate the player is during interactive traversal sections, where the player uses their hands to climb or crawl. And we split the traversal graph into two separate modes. And the different colors on the spline represent pre or post-combat and combat. And this simply indicates where you can traverse to depending on if you're in combat or not. And there's also a little bit of extra information on the spline proxies indicating the direction of travel. So as a quick tip, I found that traversing through a white box in VR with just one material can bring with it some comfort and readability issues. Essentially, the depth within your level becomes much harder to read. But luckily this is easily alleviated by mapping a different color to all the vertical aspects of your level. It sounds like a really small thing, but it really does help to give that sense of depth in VR that can otherwise be lost. Next on the agenda, metrics. So good metrics are important in all games, but for VR specifically, they can normalize the base level of comfortable traversal within your game space. If you're too close or too far away from something, then you're genuinely going to feel this. So this shows the cover metrics that we had in place on our waypoints. And the distance away from the cover was heavily user tested to ensure the following criteria. Number 1, that the player could comfortably see over the cover. Number 2, that they could duck their head and feel safe in cover. And 3, that anything that we placed on top of the cover, like ammo or weapons, could easily be reached. To ensure that these metrics were fixed, we set up prefabs with something that we called snap zones. And these are the red planes that you can see over the cover object. With the snap zones in place, all we had to do was move a waypoint towards an edge and it would just snap into position. And this took care of about 90% of the waypoints in the game. And sometimes, depending on the circumstances, we disabled snapping on a waypoint and we tweaked the location by hand. To get out of cover comfortably, we baked out splines and curved them around the cover object. And whilst this was fine for the white box stage, I wasn't particularly comfortable with the fact that these curves would always be an approximation, and they had the potential to be implemented completely differently by each of the level designers. So how is this going to scale? And what if our metrics had to change as a result of a user test? Well, we'd have to go back and update all the traversal splines by hand. And what if the next user test required us to change it again? So the answer was to set up a metrics-based system instead. Designers now had 3 different curves available to them, which could be changed within an INI file, and this would update all the splines within inside of the game. And we still baked out the odd spline here and there, especially during set pieces. But just like the snap waypoints before, this system took care of approximately 90% of the game. So now that we have a rail-based traversal system, metrically driven and tuned for comfort, let's talk about the meat of the game and explore the gameplay mechanics. So Blood and Truth's mechanics can be split into 3 different categories. First, we have a number of traversal-based ones. Next, we have some more combat-focused mechanics. And finally, we have interactables, each of which is entirely concentrated on the use of VR and motion controls. So now we've established Blood and Truth's traversal, metrics, and game mechanics. The rest is fairly classic level design. So what I'm going to do now is quickly break down a level and point out the VR considerations involved in each scene. And internally, we called this level the HQ. It's around 3/4 of the way through, so by now the player's been introduced to all the mechanics of the game. And here's a quick summary of the mission. You and your former SAS buddy Deacon have been tasked with breaking into a dubious shell company building and reporting back on any of the information you may find. Your handler, Agent Carson, has also provided you with a Trojan to upload to the bad guy systems. Okay, let's step through. It starts with a classic planning montage, a filmic technique used in films like Mission Impossible, where you plan and execute the mission at the same time. And we don't have any buddy AI within the game, but still wanted to explore how we could have you and an NPC work together across a mission. So first things first, you decide to recon the shell company building with a drone. And as we fly over the building site, we discover the following. We need to find a way to disable the generator powering the floodlights, and that we need a key card to get into the building. And often one of the things that we find with new players to VR is that they can get stuck staring in one direction. And this elevated position here gives us a unique view of the building site. And this just can encourage the player to look around the scene a little bit more. And as a quick win, we literally just reused our on-foot traversal mechanic for the drone movement. And then we added some post-processing and a little bit of audio, and this gave us the impression that we're actually looking through the camera of the drone. Okay, so once we've learned everything we need to, we montage cut back to the safe house. And now we make a plan to get into the building site. Deacon will set off the fire alarms remotely, whilst the player disguises themselves as an electrician. And for these quick in-between drama scenes, we place different interactables around the table, beer bottles, plans, etc., giving the player a chance to roleplay along with the scene. To me, this is about as cutscene as it should ever get in VR. Remember that the player always has control over the camera, so it's nice for them to have a little extra agency with inside of drama scenes. Once again, we montage cut exactly where we need to be. In this case, we gain access to the site wearing our electrician's disguise. And once we're in front of the generator, we fix the alarms by planting some remote activated det cord. And with this type of interaction, we affectionately refer to internally as a BOD, which stood for Box of Delights. And I actually read an article online where a journalist had coined the term fuse breaker puzzles, which I guess is a much better back-of-the-box quote, but I might refer to BODs throughout the rest of the talk. So we had 3 tiers of fidelity for these interaction puzzles. This one's a tier 3 due to its simplicity. We unscrew a panel, put on a det cord, job done. Tier 2 is more of a puzzle and requires at least some thought, and likely takes a few more steps to complete as well. Tier 1 is what we would call a hero asset. This still uses all the same kit parts we use to create the rest of our boards, things like the buttons, joysticks, sliders, but the main difference is the kit parts drive fairly bespoke actions, like tracking an NPC's movements through CCTV. The really important thing to take note of here is that we're never pressing X to place something. We're always asking the player to use their hands to perform actions. Okay, so the generator has been fixed with a det cord. Next, we need the foreman's ID card. So back at the safe house, Deacon has a plan to distract the foreman, dressed as the maintenance man for his building. So it looks like we'll have to climb up some scaffolding to break into the foreman's apartment. As mentioned earlier, the player can yaw rotate during interactive traversal segments like this. We can see this here as the player is physically pulling themselves along the scaffolding. And putting rotation into the player's hands like this is a huge comfort boost, likely because the tiny inner ear muscles responsible for balance are in motion as you perform the actions. So once we're in, we give Deacon a heads up over comms. Again, we don't feature any kind of buddy AI in the game, so Deacon's presence in this scene is entirely driven through VO. And as we start rifling through some drawers, we can hear him distracting the foreman downstairs. Eventually, we find a locked drawer with the ID card inside. So here's a screenshot of what our climbing implementation looks like in Editor. These are basically prefab curves that we know to be within comfortable limits. The proxy or gizmo information shows the distance that we can pull ourselves around in. And we also experiment with adding the simulated feeling of weight to the climbing interaction, as without any of this, although it's completely one-to-one, it also felt like you were superhuman. So we tuned to the balance of an action hero more like John McClane instead. Okay, so for a game with blood in the title, we've gone through the first 10 minutes of the mission and we haven't even killed anyone yet. So we're going to fix that now. Job well done on the planning. We've got the ID card and we planted the det cord. It's time for a set piece. Base jumping over the River Thames. So as you can see here, there's some basic functionality on the parachute allowing the player to bank from side to side. You can also push up or pull down on the parachute cords to raise and lower yourself. The editor proxy information here shows how far on the X and Y we can maneuver within the parachute. You can then see how we funnel this in so the player lands exactly where we want them to. It's pretty basic stuff, really. So Deacon sets off the det cord we planted earlier remotely, taking down the lights and covering your entry into the building site. It looks like there's some hired goons patrolling. In Blood and Truth, as you basically keep making forward progress, we keep the player from pushing too far forward in combat scenarios by splitting up scenes into sections. And these sections open up when the player takes out enemies. So this creates a pretty simple loop. Take out an enemy, open up a new chunk. And this is what the traversal graph looks like within this building site. The level designers were responsible for the level's layout, as well as all the traversal markup. And this meant that every single cover point in the game has gone through some considerable testing, and that we can guarantee the player's always going to have a fun route through a level. So now that the building site's clear, we can use the ID card that we jacked earlier to get into the building. Now, when you break in somewhere, it makes sense that one of the first things you might be greeted with is a security camera. And in Blood and Truth, these essentially work as lock and key puzzles. The player must now either hack the camera or start a firefight to progress. So let's take a look at the stealthier approach. To hack the camera, we use one of the bots that we talked about earlier. And we've done a similar kind of thing to this in flat screen games for years now. Remember using the analog sticks to hack things with inside of the Arkham games? Well, this is exactly the same kind of gameplay beat that we're looking for, but because it's in VR, you have that extra tactility at your disposal, which should absolutely be factored into the design of the puzzle. And we came up with the box of the delights in the middle of production, which obviously the producers weren't extremely happy with, but it felt like we didn't have enough in the level design palette to break up the gunplay. So we formed the three-person strike team and basically designed and implemented them all within around 10 weeks, start to finish. And here's what the puzzle used to look like before we switched out the designer art. And not that I want to give you the advice of, if it doesn't feel right, add more stuff during production, but this is a perfect example of what can be accomplished in a short time frame with minimal resources. Okay, so whilst we're in this maintenance corridor, let's take a look at the layout and why this makes sense for Blood and Truth. This security room to the right. In a normal FPS, it would make total sense if the door was placed here instead. It's a small thing, but it gives the space an extra dimension, right? It might even feel a little bit more normal, as it's very rare to enter a building and have all of the doors facing the exact same direction. In Blood and Truth, this was actually a level design challenge. And we got around this by extending the width of the level to accommodate doors being on the forward axis. So looking at the top down, we can see how the level is split into channels. And this gives the player some options and fits in line with our traversal method, which doesn't feature snap turning. And when we did use yaw-based rotations, we designed our level sections to curve at the same time that the player did, creating a corridor-like feeling and helping to relax the curve visually. And this featured most prominently within inside the run and gun sections of our game. So here's an example from the casino level. We can see that there's a curve on the inside corner here. We travel around it following the forward tangent of the spline at a very relaxed pace. And we also found that the corners didn't need to be 100% smooth curve. So we can see with this next corner, it's actually fairly faceted, but it still helps to lead the eye, which in turn helps the brain to process it spatially. And here's what this looks like in Editor. Another thing that really helped is the highly choreographed enemy placement around the scene. This helps to not only push the action hero pillar of the game, but it also makes great use of VR as the gunplay is happening all around you. So back to our level. Next, we jimmy open the lift shaft, and then we go subterranean by hanging on the underside of a lift as it starts moving. And then we enter the evil base proper. So this is where you want to start putting it all together. The player's done all of that legwork with Deacon during the planning phase to get into the base. So now we increase the intensity curve and start giving the player some options. On this floor, we've got a number of different room setups, which gives this base a labyrinth-like feel. We've got some patrolling guards with the classic evil base style uniforms on, and a fuse breaker puzzle leading into a room full of loot. The player can actually find an ID card for this room if they search through some nearby drawers, or they can hack in. But this obviously increases the chance of setting off the alarms and alerting guards to your presence. For this playthrough, we'll carry on stealthily. Okay, so let's review the top-down of the space and look at the traversal network. So we have our familiar forward-facing openings, and the space is split up into channels, leading to a pinch point at the end of the room. As we progress further through the base, we come across a variation on a fuse breaker puzzle that gets a little bit more complicated. And each of these fuse breaker prefabs had prefixed waypoint destinations. And to help us establish these positions, we created some really super simple metric guides to visualize the interaction range. And there isn't anything dynamic or fancy about this, it's just more within the lines of averaged ergonomics. In this next room, we force a really large firefight. This is purely to mix up the beats of the level by increasing the intensity and breaking up the stealth. So as a combat arena, the space is wide and symmetrical. The player can choose to progress up either flank or down the center. It's littered with cover points and enemies flooding from all directions. And this cover setup gives the player a lot of freedom of movement and allows them to move laterally from one side of the level to the other. And we also decided to push the ceiling higher, giving us more varied shooting angles, and also making it easier for grenades to be thrown longer distances. So once the firefight is over, Deacon and Ryan update each other through VO, and we head deeper into the base. So we wanted to chunk in a section that made it feel like the baddies were still expanding their space. And this screenshot can show how the art and design teams work together to present new ideas. Adding this section and cutting another helped us to provide an area where the look and feel is totally different to the rest of the level, but continues to work on similar principles. So along with the standard guards, we also have a generator. And using a kit part from one of our bods, we can flip a switch to turn off some lights. And if you do this, a guard will react and go off to investigate. And this leaves you with one less enemy to take out if a firefight breaks out. I also wanted to show here what I like to call a legitimate hack. So we integrated a stealth route on the left side of the level, where you can crawl on the top of these boxes, staying low and peeking through. To make things easy for us, we simply reskinned a vent crawl prefab. And that way, everything that stays within inside of the metrics, and all we're doing is swapping out some meshes. So here's a side-by-side comparison. Once we get through the tunnel, we get to another bot interaction. If we found a code on the notepad in the previous section, we can just type that in. Otherwise, we can hack it, which again has a slightly more difficult setup. Earlier, I talked about the fuse breaker puzzles embodying the same kind of beat as using a gadget in the Arkham games. And this intensity graph shows us how far through the level we currently are. Studying it, we can see that there are lots of evenly spaced out drops in intensity. And although this is fairly typical in action-adventure missions, it's important to look at it through the lens of VR. If you've just come out of an intense battle, or you're about to go into one, giving the player a rest helps to avoid something we like to call VR fatigue. Carrying on with our mission, Deacon takes out a guard and updates us further on what he's seen in the base. And this further builds on that feeling that we're still on a mission with him. And the positioning of these narrative moments is something that we spend a lot of time on at London Studio. This is all in an effort to make sure that the players get a great view of an actor's performance. We're getting close to the end now, so the intensity curve is trending higher. And this room features a lot of lateral cover and gaps between, creating channels for the player to move forward. And our cover metrics are ensuring that all the ammo and grenades are placed within comfortable distance. And the shelving here also creates a nice cover type that is completely unique to VR. With all the gaps between the boxes, the player has to physically search for an opening to shoot enemies through. And this could be even more effective in stealth sections, giving the player that feeling of being a hunter. In the last room of the level, we plant the Trojan, triggering a violent shootout on a massive storage elevator. And this combination of the epic scale of this room and the dynamic movement you get from the elevator gives us a fitting combat scenario for the end of our level. To me, it embodies the power of VR, transporting the player into a location and situation that they're likely never to experience in real life, and giving them a chance to roleplay as an action hero. So there we have it. In summary, pay extra special attention to metric data. The last and first thing you want to be worrying about when making a game is comfort issues. Establish your game mechanics. Think about what makes them only possible in VR. It doesn't need to be some super expensive 360 dream sequence. I mean, those are cool, but even something as simple as throwing a scrunched up paper ball into a bin can be quite magical in VR. Review your level often and keep asking yourself the question, how can it be more VR? And finally, play lots of VR games. Some awesome games out there now that will serve as an inspiration. For example, if you haven't already played Blood and Truth, why not go pick yourself up a copy? So I hope this little run through has helped anyone that's thinking about how to translate their work into VR and how some of the more typical action adventure principles can work within the field. But thank you very much for listening. You're more than welcome to mail me if you have any questions regarding the talk. Thanks again.